All right, here we are again. So, all right, we got a lot to do today. And let me just get something out for you. So, anyway, yeah, let's go to Moodle for a second. Let's see, where are we? All right, so here's what I did. So we have, we're about to start chapter 12. And, but in the meantime, we have, I wrote a that problem set we were working on last time with the comparative advantage. There was a problem with it somewhere in there that I wasn't able to fix. So what I did was I just created a completely new one right here. So I'd like to go over that one today and just get this straightened out. It's a little bit different. This time it's US and Brazil. I changed the product slightly. This time it's cranberries and coffee. All right. So, but it's a very similar problem set, but the numbers are a little bit different. But this time they actually work, which is good. I don't know what happened to the other one. It just, something was wrong with it. So I just decided to throw it out and start all over again with this one. Now, at the same time, though, so we'll do that today. And then here's chapter 4 problem set. We can save that one for Thursday because you haven't seen it yet. This is chapter 4 problem set, which involves supply and demand for obviously goods and services, but the focus of it is on what is the impact of a tariff. In particular, you'll have to draw some supply and demand curves, but what we really want to understand is what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenues when a tariff is imposed on an imported good. So that's what's going on in this problem set. So this one you can work on for Thursday. For today, though, let's go back and revisit the second problem set, which was such a mess last time that I fixed it and it should work just fine now. And so we'll get to practice with all the most important skills that we need from chapter 2. And so then when all of this is done, we can dive right back into chapter 12, which I've now posted the first part of it in Moodle. All right. Now here it is over here. Yes. So the chapter 12 part 1 is here. So we'll be looking at that probably today. And other than that, I think that's all we're going to do today. So chapter 2 problem set for today, chapter 4 problem set for next time. And then with whatever's time is left over, we'll go over the beginning of chapter 12. I think, oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, I just remembered. There's one more topic in chapter 11 that we didn't quite get to. Let me go get that open. That's right. I almost forgot about that till just now. That would be the discussion about something called, oh man, there's a lot of information here. That very last topic in chapter 11, which we never quite got around to, was called uncovered interest parity, or uncovered interest arbitrage, sometimes called the carry trade. This will only take a few minutes to go over. So why don't we go over the second problem set first, then we'll finish up chapter 11, and then we'll get into 12. That sounds good. All right, so let me get this thing open again. The chapter 2 problem set, the new one that is, we have the US and Brazil, and each one has the capability of growing cranberries and coffee, but we're going to assume that the soil in the US and the temperature is better suited for cranberries than it is in Brazil. Okay, Brazil is a tropical climate. Cranberries grow well where it's cold and where the soil is very sandy. So that's not very, it sounds like the type of crop that wouldn't grow particularly well in Brazil, but it does grow very well in the United States. Coffee, on the other hand, grows well in a hot climate. And certainly the United States can grow coffee in Hawaii, but that's about the extent of it. Most of the time, you'd expect Brazil would be the place where you grow coffee rather than the United States. Okay, so how does this work again? Let's take a look at this chart, and then we're going to calculate the opportunity cost that the U.S. incurs in order to produce a pound of cranberries. All right. So the way you have to look at it is this. The U.S. uses 1 hour of labor to produce 1 pound of cranberries. The same hour of labor could be used to produce 1/4 of a pound of coffee. Why do I say that? Because, as you can see in the chart, it takes the US 4 hours to grow a pound of coffee. So an hour of labor could only be used to produce a pound of coffee. So therefore, the opportunity cost of producing a pound of cranberries is 1/4 of a pound of coffee. So that's the answer right there, 1/4, which is not very high, obviously, because it's not something that the US is well suited for. On the other hand, with coffee, the US uses 1 hour, 4 hours, I should say, 4 hours of labor to produce 1 pound of coffee. The same 4 hours of labor could have been used to produce 4 pounds of cranberries. Therefore, the opportunity cost of producing a pound of coffee is 4 pounds of cranberries. So it's a very steep opportunity cost. And you can see already where this is headed. Clearly, it doesn't really make sense for the US to try to grow coffee because the opportunity cost is so high. Now, when we look at the perspective of Brazil, though, everything works in reverse. Okay, so first let me split the screen so we can see what we're doing as we go along. So for Brazil, in order to produce 1 pound of cranberries, Brazil uses 8 hours of labor. The same 8 hours of labor could have been used to produce 4 pounds of coffee. Because they only take 2 hours each, therefore the opportunity cost of producing cranberries is 4 pounds of coffee. Pretty steep. Okay. Now, what's the opportunity cost that Brazil incurs in producing 1 pound of coffee? So in order to produce 1 pound of coffee, Brazil uses 2 hours of labor. The same 2 hours could have been used to produce 1/4 of a pound of cranberries, given that it takes 8 hours to make a pound. Therefore, the opportunity cost of producing a pound of coffee is 1/4 pound of cranberries. Okay, so if you were to put together a little chart that shows the opportunity costs, in fact, let me do exactly that. Let me grab this chart or table. I'll move it down here, and then I'll relabel it, of course. So for the US, the pound of cranberries only required us to give up 1/4 pound of coffee. Okay. Let's see if I can make this a little neater. Now it's being stubborn with me. There we go. Okay, and then for the U.S., the coffee required 4 pounds of cranberry to produce. And then for Brazil, it was the other way around. 4 pounds of coffee versus 1/4 pound of cranberries. So having them all together in one place makes it easier to answer the remaining questions. Oops. There we go. Okay, that looks good. So, oh, okay, well, it doesn't quite work, but it's good enough. All right, anyway, so which country has an absolute advantage in the production of the cranberries? Now, for that, we need to look at the top again. Now, as far as the cranberries are concerned, the U.S. can make them with fewer hours of labor. Therefore, the U.S. can produce cranberries with fewer hours of labor than Brazil, so that it has an absolute advantage in the production of cranberries. All right, that's all it takes. Now, on the other hand, in the coffee, it looks like it's going to go to Brazil because it only takes them 2 hours to make coffee versus 4 in the United States. All right, very good. So Brazil can produce coffee with fewer hours of labor than the US, so that Brazil has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee. All right. Let me just fix this for a second. There we go. But then when it comes to the comparative advantage, we're thinking in terms of opportunity costs. So since the US has a lower opportunity cost in the production of cranberries than Brazil, the US has the comparative advantage in the production of cranberries. Okay. Which country then has a comparative advantage in the coffee? Well, clearly this works in reverse. Since Brazil has a lower opportunity cost in the production of coffee than the US, Brazil has the comparative advantage in the production of coffee. There you go. All right, perfect. Now, we're going to assume that the US has 1,000 hours available to it of labor and Brazil 800. All right, so for this part, I'm going to split the screen again so you can look at this table as we go along. All right, so remember, 1,000 hours. The US can only make cranberries. Well, they have 1,000 hours of labor. It takes an hour to make each pound of cranberries. Therefore, we must be able to produce 1,000 pounds of cranberries. Now, if we make coffee and just coffee, well, that might be a mistake because that only leaves us with 250 pounds of coffee because each pound of coffee requires 4 hours. All right, now, if Brazil, on the other hand, specializes in the production of cranberries, well, all right, let's see. That's not going to work very well because they only have 800 hours And so that would leave them with 100 pounds of cranberries. And then finally, in the other direction, 800 divided by 2 equals 400 pounds of coffee. Okay, because it only takes Brazil 2 hours to make a pound of coffee. So with 800 hours of labor, they can make 400 pounds of coffee. Now, in the absence of trade, let's make some assumptions here. So the US produces and consumes. With no trade, we have to produce the same amount that we produce. So we have 125 coffees, 500 pounds of cranberries. Okay. Do we need this chart? We're assuming let's see. Yeah, that works. Okay. And then for Brazil, they'll make 50 pounds of cranberries and 200 pounds of coffee. All right, that's perfect. Oh, sorry, 200 pounds of coffee, 50 pounds of cranberries. All right. Now, for this part, we're being asked to draw some pictures. So before trade takes place, so this is what we need to know. First of all, in order to describe the axes, we need to know the limits that they can produce in each country. So in other words, we'll put coffee on the vertical axis. Okay, so we've already seen that the US can make 1,000 pounds of cranberries, if that's all they do. And they can only make 250 pounds of coffee, though. The point that they're choosing to consume it, though, is 125 and 500. So that's, you can see on their production possibilities frontier, that is one of the many points at which they're capable of producing. And because people like cranberries and coffee in the US, it looks like we'll just split it up. We'll have half of our resources go into the coffee, and the other half are going into the cranberries. Okay, so that's the US. Now, how about Brazil? Brazil, as we've already seen, okay, so let's put coffee up here. The maximum they can produce of coffee is 400 pounds, and they can only make 100 pounds of cranberries. So their production possibilities frontier will be quite steep. Really steeper than that. I didn't draw it particularly well, but let's just say this is what it looks like. And they choose to produce and consume 50 pounds of cranberries and 200 pounds of coffee. So they also like both products very well. All right. So they're producing at that point, but those are the choices that they have. Now, in 15, or this next section, we're assuming that the two countries will specialize in and then trade 150 pounds of cranberries to Brazil in exchange for 150 pounds of coffee. All right, so this one's a little bit more complicated because we have to take into account how much each country is making as they specialize. And then you have to keep track of how much they're trading and how much they end up with. Okay, so I'll need a series of charts. I'll just copy this one, I guess, and rework it a little. All right, so here's how this goes. So we'll start out with the without trade. All right, so we have cranberries and coffee. And we saw earlier that on the US graph, we have in the US, they've chosen to produce 125 pounds of coffee and 500 pounds of cranberries. Brazil, on the other hand, chooses to produce 200 coffees, 200 pounds of coffee, and 50 pounds of cranberries. Then we need to keep track of what's going on with specialization. All right, so when in that case, the US only makes cranberries. In fact, the US can make 1,000 cranberries, but no coffees. Oh, wait a minute, something's not right. I labeled something wrong. Oh God, look what happened. No, I have to fix this. Somehow I got everything backwards here. You know what it was? Because these are the opportunity costs. Okay, so no, these are reversed. It should be 500 pounds of cranberries with 125 coffees. And over here, I have it backwards too. Brazil makes 50 pounds of cranberries and 200 coffees, right? Okay. So that's why, because I shouldn't have used this table as a starting point because I had everything backwards. So in other words, without trade, if you put cranberries on top, the U.S. is producing 500 cranberries with 125 coffees, whereas Brazil is producing 200 coffees with 50 cranberries. All right, now it's all set. Okay, now with specialization then, what happens is with specialization, the U.S. can make 1,000 pounds of cranberries, but no coffee. Whereas Brazil makes no coffee, makes no cranberries, but they can make up to 400 pounds of coffee. All right, that's much better. Then they trade, okay? So remember, they're trading 150 cranberries for 150 coffees. Okay, so what that means is the US gives up 150 pounds of cranberries to gain 150 pounds of coffee. Whereas in Brazil, they gain 150 pounds of cranberries, but now they only have 250 pounds of coffee. So what are the gains from trade? Now that's the interesting part. So the way we have to do with this is compare these boxes when there was no trade. I mislabeled this. This is with, hold on. This is with specialization. This is with specialization and trade. Okay, hold on. Okay, so you're comparing the first one with the third one now. All right, so without trade, this is what we had. With trade, we have this one. These are the ones you're comparing to each other. In fact, you know what, maybe I'll color them the same color so we can see what's going on here. So that's with trade. This is without trade. This is with specialization in trade. So in order to figure them out, now the US went from 500 to 850 cranberries. So that means we must have gained 350 pounds of cranberries from this exchange. With the coffee, we previously had 125, now we have 150, so we gained 25 pounds of coffee. With Brazil, we previously had 50 pounds of cranberries, now we have 150. And then finally, with the coffee, Brazil previously had 200, now they have 50. All right, so in other words, as far as cranberries go, the US increased their consumption of cranberries by 350, Brazil by 100. And then here with the coffee, the US gains 25, Brazil gains 50. Now, the increase in world output would be for cranberries, all you have to do is add up the gains from trade. 350 plus 100 means that the world now has 450 more cranberries than we did before. And then for coffee, we just add those two together. We get 25 plus 50. And that gives us an increase of 75 extra pounds of coffee, all because of trade. So I've actually already answered all these questions down here with these charts. How much of each good will the US consume after trade takes place? How much will Brazil consume? That actually would be this part right here. In fact, why don't I sneak those questions up here so you can see that they specifically refer to that chart. Okay, so in others here, all we did was show what happened without trade and with specialization. And after trade takes place, what is the result? And the gains from trade, it doesn't specifically ask about that, but it does ask for the increase in world output. And so therefore, that's what this is all about. All right, so finally this thing is done. It's all correct, it's all consistent, the numbers are good. So this one I'll be posting, Moodle, of course. And on the Blackboard, Moodle, you will see the corrected version of this plus these answers. So you can start getting ready for when we eventually start having exams. This, of course, will have to be there. And in fact, it'll be a major component of the first midterm. Okay, so now finally, at long last, this is all completely correct. Very good. So once again, don't forget, we're going to cover the rest of 11 today. We're going to start 12. Next time, we'll go over the chapter 4 problem set, which I showed you a few minutes ago. And then at some point next week, we'll start figuring out what to do about a midterm. All right, so that has to be coming up pretty soon because we've waited a long time and we don't want to wait too much longer. But in the meantime, we can focus our attention on the rest of this chapter 11. This is a situation that's somewhat related to what we've been doing. In fact, it closely resembles this covered interest arbitrage, where we were looking for violations of the relationship between the forward exchange rate and the spot exchange rate. And we saw that if there's a violation of the interest rate parity condition, then we can earn arbitrage profits. Uncovered interest arbitrage is a little different because it's not strictly speaking an arbitrage. The reason why we don't call it an arbitrage is that it's not risk-free. We're not going to enter into a forward contract in this case. Instead, there's a bit of a gamble involved. Now, this is something that used to be very popular with traders a long time ago when Japanese interest rates were much lower than American interest rates. In fact, a lot of this carry trade took place between the dollar and the yen. And the reason for that was because Japanese interest rates were so low and the US interest rates were much higher than they are now, that what ended up happening was that traders would borrow Japanese yen and then they would convert them into US dollars and then they would invest them in American bank accounts. And they would leave them there for a while. And then at a certain point in the future, they would cash their dollars back in for yen. And as long as there wasn't a dramatic change in exchange rates, it proved to be very profitable. But there was always a gamble involved because at no point in this process do we actually enter into a forward contract. So unlike the other two cases we looked at, triangular arbitrage and covered interest arbitrage, which are really and truly risk-free, this one is not. Now, I also want to mention in passing that now, since US rates and Japanese rates are so close to each other, you don't really see this very much anymore. But it used to be very popular, at least in the 80s and 90s, because of that huge spread between the yen interest rates and American interest rates, which persisted for year after year after year, and nobody ever thought anything would change. But anyway, how does it actually work? Okay, so it's not a risk-free process. So technically the word arbitrage is not correct here. And that's one of the reasons why it's called the carry trade, because it isn't really, strictly speaking, an arbitrage. But the logic is that you are borrowing in a country with very low interest rates, and you're using the funds that you've borrowed to lend in a country with higher interest rates. And as a result, you're hoping to make a profit. But at the same time, though, you are assuming some foreign exchange risk. So like here, for example, what if we're looking at the dollar and the yen, known as the yen carry trade? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to borrow yen and pay the euro-yen rate, which again was traditionally very, very low. Then we'll convert those yen into dollars at the spot exchange rate. And once we have dollars, we'll deposit those in a euro-dollar deposit account. Eventually, when it comes time to repay the yen that we borrowed, we have to convert our dollars back into yen and then repay the loan. Okay, so hopefully this works. We'll see how this might not work when we go through this procedure. So we'll start out by assuming that the spot exchange rate between the dollar and the yen is 100 yen per dollar. The 180-day euro-dollar deposit rate is 3%, and the 180-day euro-yen deposit rate is 0.5%. So how would this work in practice? All right, now keep in mind you're always borrowing in these cases. So we have to start, we want to borrow yen because the interest rate is so low compared to the United States. So let's do that. Let's assume that we're going to borrow 10 million yen for 180 days. The rate of interest that will be charged is 0.5%, which is an annual rate, by the way. And as soon as we get our hands on those yen, we immediately trade them for dollars at the current spot exchange rate, which is 100 yen per dollar. So that means we'll have 100,000 US dollars. All right, what do we do with them? Well, we don't just throw them under our mattress. We put them in a euro-dollar account. And by the way, this procedure is not just restricted to American traders. If you're already in the United States, you don't even really need to bother with a euro-dollar account. You could put it in a domestic bank. But typically, these types of transactions are done in the euro currency markets because the rates that they pay tend to be slightly higher. So we'll take our 100,000, convert it into, or deposit it in a euro-dollar account where we'll earn 3% for 180 days. Now, it sounds like a steal. You're borrowing at 0.5%, you're lending at 3%. What could go wrong? Well, let's find out. So what happens in 180 days? Our dollar deposit is worth $101,500 because you earn 3% over a period of 6 months, which means that you actually earned 1.5%. So after 6 months or 180 days, our deposit is worth $101,500. Now, if we assume, and this is where it gets tricky, that the spot exchange rate between the yen and the dollar hasn't changed, it stayed at 100, then when we convert our dollars back into yen, the cost of the yen loan, because the Japanese rate was 0.5% for 6 months, that would give us, or we would have to pay 10,025,000 yen to repay the loan. And when you convert that back into dollars, by dividing it by the yen dollar exchange rate, that means that we must pay $100,250 to buy enough yen to repay the loan. Okay, so the total profit is equal to $1,250. And let's look at the graph that shows us why this happened. We started out down here in the bottom left-hand corner by borrowing yen, 10 million yen to be exact. We converted them into dollars at the current spot exchange rate of 100 per dollar, which brought us $100,000. We deposited them in a euro dollar account for 180 days or 6 months, which brought us $101,500. Now, because we owe money in yen, we have to convert these dollars back into yen at whatever the spot exchange rate happens to be in 180 days. Now, let's say it's still at 100 to keep it simple. That means our dollars are now worth 10,150,000 yen. The loan, though, only cost us 10,025,000 yen that we have to pay back. So we put the difference, or 125,000 yen, in our pockets. Now, it is a foreign currency, but still that represents a profit. No matter what the exchange rate is, we'll make money on this. But now here's the risk. This is what the traders had to worry about. What if the yen gets stronger in the next 180 days? What would happen differently? Suppose, for example, that instead of 100, the exchange rate in 180 days went down to 90. Okay, and of course that means that the yen has gotten stronger against the dollar. All right, so let's replace this with 90. Okay, so it takes fewer yen to buy the dollar. That means the yen has gotten stronger. How many yen did we earn from our investment? Well, now remember, to get to this point, we multiplied. So if you take $101,500 and multiply it by 90 yen per dollar, this is how many yen you'll wind up with. It will be, hold on 1 second, I'm looking around here for my calculator, which has of course disappeared. Oh, I see it. Okay, got buried under something else. All right, here we go. So let's multiply these together. $101,500 times 90 yen per dollar. Oh no, we have a problem. 9,135,000 yen is all that we'll have. So our earnings are 9,135,000 yen. So guess what? We just lost quite a bit of money, as a matter of fact. Let me just figure out the difference. That's 890,000 yen, about 10,000 US dollars. So that was our biggest fear. You notice how there's a risk here. We did not enter into a forward contract. Now, the reason why we did not enter into a forward contract is because if we did, we would have ended up with exactly the same amount of money that we started with, and none of this would have made any sense. So basically, we're saying to ourselves, we're willing to take a chance that the yen will not get any stronger. And if we're right, we'll make money off the difference between the two countries' interest rates. And not only that, but if the yen got weaker for some reason, we would have made even more money because those those dollars, wow, they would have been worth 165,000 yen. Wow, our profit would have been huge because remember, we only have to repay just over 10 million yen. So our profit then, wait, hold on a second. Would have been about 1.14 million yen, which would have been worth about 10,400 US dollars. So this is why the traders were willing to try this. They felt that the yen would not likely appreciate. And in the meantime, they could take advantage of the spread between Japanese and American interest rates. Most of the time, they were right, at least during that period in the 80s and 90s. Eventually, this relationship started breaking down. It became more and more risky. And now, the other thing that changed is that US rates and Japanese rates are so close to each other that there's no real room for profits here. So that's why this is no longer a very popular procedure. But in principle, it could be done with any two currencies as long as their interest rates are significantly different from each other. But you can see also it is not a true arbitrage. So anyway. Oh, it depends on which currency you're borrowing. If you're borrowing dollars, you start here. And if you're borrowing yen, you start down here. And you also end up over here. If you're borrowing dollars, this will be the final point where you compare your profits and losses. Okay, so we saw both cases when we were looking at covered interest parity. Okay, good. Yeah, with covered interest rate parity, it could have gone either way. But here, this is a very specific situation where the goal is to borrow yen because they're so much cheaper, at least the interest rate is lower, and then lend out in dollars. Whereas with covered interest parity, it could have gone either way. That was determined by the value of F. Okay, if it was too high, we went one way. If it was too low, we went the other way. Okay, so don't worry, we'll get plenty more practice with this stuff before we have any tests that include this material. This will not be on the first midterm, by the way. The first midterm is all about international trade only. This will have to wait till the second midterm. All right. Well, now that it's almost April, we have to start thinking that, we're kind of zooming along in this semester. Before, it seemed like this semester would go on forever because we didn't have a spring break. But now that it's getting close to April, we have to begin to think, time is running out, isn't it? We're only slightly past the halfway mark, but still there's a lot to go. So anyway, with all that being said, now we can move our attention to chapter 12. And I think I've already mentioned this. Chapter 12 is a little bit different because the focus is on where do exchange rates come from in the first place. Okay, we haven't really talked about that yet. What exactly is it that drives the values of exchange rates in the marketplace? Up to this point, we've essentially been taking them for granted. Now we want to take a closer look at where exactly do they come from. In other words, what factors are responsible for the exchange rates that we see in the marketplace? Now, of course, there's a lot of them, but we can reduce them to a handful of the most important factors. But before we do that, we want to note that we're going to make a distinction here between the long run and the short run. Certain factors will affect currencies more in the short run than in the long run. So the way to think about it is this. Let me just mention this here. First of all, in economics, we usually make this distinction in the following way. Often, it is assumed that the short run is a time frame in which prices do not have time to change. Okay, in other words, prices are fixed. And then in the long run, prices are flexible. Okay, so that's one way we can think about short term and long term in economics. Now, as far as exchange rates are concerned, we're going to assume a few things. We will assume that in the short run, the main motivation for buying foreign currencies is to invest in foreign financial assets. The main, I mean, certainly you're using currencies to buy goods and services, but um, a lot of the trading in the marketplace is really coming from people buying and selling foreign stocks, foreign bonds, putting their money in foreign bank accounts, that type of thing. But we'll also assume that in the long run, the main motivation for buying foreign currencies is to buy foreign goods and services. I mean, in the long short run, you're investing your money, you're trying to save, you're saving for your retirement, but eventually, at some point, all that money you have accumulated, there's only one thing you can really do with it, and that is to buy goods and services. So, in the short run, investors are soon to be more focused on rates of return, whereas in the long run, we're assuming that the main motivation for buying these currencies is to acquire foreign goods and services. So the behavior of exchange rates will therefore be very different in the short run than in the long run. And that's a key detail. So we're actually going to start with the long run first. It's a little bit easier to explain it. So let's start there by looking at some of the most important factors that determine exchange rates in the long run. And here's some of them. Prices, like I said, in the short run, prices are assumed to be fixed, so they're irrelevant. But in the long run, the price level does make a big difference. Then there we see productivity, consumer preferences, and we also see included in here trade barriers, which we'll discuss when we get to that point. But we've already seen enough of this to know that trade barriers are designed to protect domestic producers and keep their profits as high as possible. But they unfortunately have the impact of increasing the cost of goods to domestic consumers. All right, so let's take a look at these one at a time. In the long run, any factor that increases the attractiveness of a country's goods and services will strengthen its currency. So, for example, if every time Apple brings out a new iPad or iPhone that people love, that should strengthen the dollar because foreigners will want to buy iPads and iPhones. But on the other hand, if there's anything that causes our goods to be less attractive, well, it happens too. Like, what if the next Windows is really in bad shape? It has a lot of bugs. That would have a tendency to weaken the dollar because people will stop buying Windows or at least see if they can find something else. So, in the long run, we're focused on what is it that makes people want to buy our products. That's what it is that should strengthen our currency. Okay, so we're going to bring back supply and demand curves. You may remember we started to do this in chapter 11. In fact, let me go get 11 back so you can see what they looked like. Hold on. Somewhere in here, I've got supply. Here we go. So we're going to assume that on the vertical axis, we have dollars per pound. On the horizontal axis, we have demand millions of pounds. That diagram right there happens to be the demand curve for pounds, which, as you can see, is downward sloping. Because on the vertical axis, as we move up that axis, you can see, and it's labeled right here, it becomes more and more expensive to buy British pounds. And that means we have a weaker dollar. So we will respond by buying fewer British pounds, of course. As the dollar gets stronger, meaning that we need to pay fewer dollars per pound, we will, of course, respond by buying more British pounds. And once we get our hands on British pounds, we're going to use them, presumably, to buy British goods and services in the long run. We also had a supply curve, which means that we're supplying, and by the way, in this graph, remember, pounds run this horizontal axis. So the supply of pounds is coming to the United States from the British when they buy our products. Okay, so in other words, if the Brits buy American products, they need to use their own pounds to acquire dollars to buy those goods. Therefore, the supply curve refers to the supply of pounds, and it is upward sloping. Okay. All right, so let's get back to 12. And now this should all hopefully make sense. So let's start by looking at the US price level. Now, the price level, you can think of that as an index, which represents the overall cost of goods and services in the United States. The classic example would be the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which you may have heard of. Let me just sneak this in here. An example of a US price index is the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which measures the cost of living in the US. The equivalent UK version is known as the RPI, which stands for Retail Price Index. And it measures, of course, the cost of living in the UK. Now, these price levels will change over time. They typically go up. Okay, they don't usually go down, but when they go up, the question is, which one is going up faster? So if the US price level rises more quickly than the UK price level, then American goods become more expensive to both American and British consumers. So both American and British consumers are likely to buy more British goods. What does that have to do with our model here? So UK consumers are less likely to buy American goods, which means the supply of pounds to the United States is going down. On the other hand, Americans are buying more British goods, which means the demand for pounds is going up. So two things are actually changing here. The supply of pounds is falling, and the demand for pounds is increasing. What does that look like on a graph? Let's take a look. So it turns out that this causes the dollar to get weaker, okay? Because it goes from $1.50 a pound to $1.60, which means a weaker dollar. But of course, it makes perfect sense. Remember, we did say that in the long run, the more attractive our goods and services are, the stronger the dollar will be. But a higher US price level means that our goods are becoming very expensive, and that reduces their attractiveness to consumers, and that should weaken the dollar. Which is I hope that this makes sense to you. Higher price levels means people will want to buy fewer of that country's goods, and their currency should depreciate as a result. So in other words, if you look around the world, high inflation countries tend to have very weak currencies, and that's one of the main reasons. Now, of course, as you can probably imagine, the reverse is true too, though. If US price levels are either falling or rising more slowly than they are in the UK, then everything works in reverse. That means people want to buy more American goods, and the curves will move in the opposite directions, meaning that there's a decrease in the demand for pounds, an increase in the supply of pounds, and so everything works in reverse. You'll see a stronger dollar. And again, it's because our goods are more attractive now to consumers, domestic and foreign. All right, productivity. What does that have to do with anything? Well, productivity increases means that US producers can typically sell their products at a lower cost. So this is essentially the opposite of what we just saw. Higher US productivity means that US prices are falling or rising more slowly than UK prices. And so this is essentially the same thing. Higher productivity lowers prices in the US, which means that we'll end up with a stronger dollar. Okay, and it's the exact same reasoning. With higher US productivity and lower prices, UK consumers are more likely to buy US goods, which increases the supply of pounds to the United States, whereas Americans are going to buy fewer UK goods and more American goods, which means that reduces our demand for pounds. So what happens here is that the dollar should get stronger because, as you can see, the supply of pounds goes up, the demand for pounds goes down, and down here in the new equilibrium point, the dollar is a lot stronger, 140 per pound versus 150. But as you can imagine, this can cut both directions. What if UK productivity is rising more quickly than US productivity? Then everything just works in reverse. Okay, in other words, you can see the curves will go in the opposite directions, and the result of that would be a weaker dollar. Okay, a weaker dollar. And again, I hope it makes sense intuitively. High productivity should lead people to want to buy more of your products, or at the very least, the costs are falling, and therefore you should expect to have a stronger currency. Now, what about preferences? What is this all about? This is basically consumer tastes. Sometimes Americans will want to buy more foreign products than they used to, or it could go the other way around. So, in other words, tastes of consumers can affect the strength of the dollar. So, in other words, if Americans suddenly want to buy more British goods for whatever reason, then they will in fact buy more US goods, UK goods, which means that they'll buy fewer US goods. Now, this does not influence the quantity of US goods that the British want to buy. This only affects the US demand for pounds. So suddenly Americans want to buy up lots of sticky toffee pudding, whereas before they never heard of it. Now they suddenly want it all the time. So we start to buy more UK goods and less American goods. So the demand for pounds goes up with no change in the supply. And so this is the net effect. Here's our demand for pounds, and that pushes up the exchange rate, which means a weaker dollar. Now, obviously, as you can probably guess, if the reverse happens, if Americans suddenly decide that they're tired of British goods and they want to buy more American goods, then the reverse would happen. The demand curve would shift to the left, and we'd end up with a stronger dollar. But again, you notice there's no change in the supply of pounds because that's coming from the British. Their tastes haven't changed. It's American tastes that's changed. That's why this is happening. Okay. How about trade barriers? What does that have to do with anything? Well, we've already discussed this in an earlier chapter, but we know that the US government sometimes imposes trade barriers on imported goods. We've seen tariffs, we've seen quotas. We know that a tariff is a tax on imports, and a quota is a numerical limit on how much can be imported. But either way, The net effect is to protect domestic producers by making foreign goods more expensive in the United States. So the purpose of this is to reduce competition to our domestic producers. The problem is that it imposes higher costs on American consumers. So you and I end up paying higher prices because the government is protecting a domestic industry. That being the case, we'll probably buy less British goods, and therefore, as a result, the demand for pounds will decrease. And in the process, that will make the dollar stronger. All right. This is what it looks like. So in other words, the existence of US trade barriers will cause the demand for pounds to shrink because British goods are artificially overpriced now. And so this is the net effect. And you notice once more, there's no change in the supply of pounds because it doesn't affect the British desire to buy American goods. It only affects our desire to buy British goods. Now, if the US, on the other hand, gets rid of some of its trade barriers, then this all would work in reverse. Then suddenly Americans would buy more British goods. And therefore, the demand curve shifts to the right. And ultimately, we'd have a weaker dollar. Okay, so all of that represented are four main factors that help determine the value of exchange rates in the long run. But now we're going to be introduced to a few new ideas here. We're going to be looking at other factors that can help influence the value of an exchange rate. We're going to start with this idea of what's called purchasing power parity. And purchasing power parity is a theory that says that the exchange rates between two countries should ultimately be determined by the two countries' relative price levels and nothing else, just price levels. Now, when this theory was first proposed, which was, hundreds of years ago, it may very well have been at that time that this was a valid explanation as to where exchange rates come from. But now, as you'll see in a few minutes, there's very little reason to think that it might actually hold. Okay, so let's find out why. Okay, and the reason for this is because in order for PPP to hold, there's one thing that has to be true in the marketplace, and that is referred to as the law of one price, which means that a good will sell for the same price in all markets. In the case of domestic and foreign markets, we can extend that to say the good should sell for the same price after adjusting for the exchange rate. All right, but any way you look at it, according to the law of one price, everything should have the same price in all markets and in all countries. Now, the big question is whether or not that's true. Quick example, what if gold sells for $800 an ounce in the United States when the exchange rate between the dollar and the pound is $2 a pound? Well, that implies that the price in Britain should be 400 pounds an ounce. Okay, what if it doesn't though? What if there's a discrepancy? What could potentially happen? Well, guess what people might start to do? And keeping in mind that let's assume that we could buy gold in the UK for less than 400 pounds an ounce. In other words, gold is cheaper in the UK than in the US. What is likely to happen? Well, because the gold is cheaper in the UK, people will buy it there, and then they can turn around and sell it in the United States and put the difference in their pockets. That is actually a type of arbitrage, which is called goods arbitrage. Now, on the other hand, now, by the way, what would happen as a result of this? As everyone starts buying gold in the UK, the price will go up. And as people start selling gold in the US, the price will go down. And pretty quickly, the price would be the same in both countries. At which point we say that the law of one price is reestablished, or it holds. Now, you can probably imagine this works in both directions. What if the gold is overpriced in the UK? For example, what if it's selling for more than 400 pounds? Then we would do the opposite. We'd buy the gold in the United States where it's relatively cheap and sell it in the UK where it's relatively expensive. Now, of course, this won't last for long because as people start buying gold in the US, the price will go up. They'll sell gold in the UK and that causes the price to go down. And pretty quickly, the prices will be equal once again in the two countries. So even when these opportunities present themselves, they are not likely to last very long. And yes, we call this process goods arbitrage. So in a case like that, you would expect the law of one price to hold pretty much all the time, for gold at least. But how about other goods and services? All right, well, what about let's try this. What about other types of goods? Suppose now I'm picking this good on purpose. There's a reason for this. Suppose that when the exchange rate is, let's keep it simple, $2 a pound. The price of a Big Mac is $4 in the US and let's say 1.50 pounds in the United Kingdom. Well, then it should be clear that at this exchange rate, the UK price is only $3 for the Big Mac. Okay, so can we earn an arbitrage in this case? Well, the answer is no, for a couple of reasons. For example, no, for a couple of reasons. No, number one, by the time, if Big Macs are purchased in the UK and sold in the US, they would have spoiled by the time they reached the US, which is not true of gold. And number two, Big Macs, the cost of shipping them overseas would wipe out any arbitrage profits that could be earned. Okay, so in other words, this is not likely to hold with the Big Macs. And even if they're not spoiled, I mean, even if they're just kept refrigerated and you have to reheat them, it's just not the same, is it? So it's not likely that you'll want to ship Big Macs back and forth between the US and the UK because of the fact that they are, they do eventually spoil and the cost of shipping them would be prohibitive. So for goods like these, are referred to as non-traded goods. Okay, meaning that we would not normally expect to see them traded back and forth between the two countries. And therefore, the existence for these goods, I should say, the law of one price is not likely to hold. And so, to the extent that the law of one price doesn't hold, PPP will not hold either. Now, why did I pick the Big Mac? Because it turns out that the Economist magazine, at some point in their history, maybe in the late 80s, they came up with this idea to see if PPP holds by comparing the prices of Big Macs in every country in the world. And as you can imagine, what they discovered is that it doesn't hold very well at all. So that gives me an excuse now that we've gotten to that point, it gives me an excuse to show you a couple of videos which talk about the Big Mac Index. Okay, and I think you'll find these very interesting. So why don't we take a shot at those? Hold on one second. No, not that one. Hold on. And you'll definitely like these. Okay, here we go. We'll start by looking at Big Mac economics. All right, let's check this out. And I think you'll find it very interesting. Hi there. All right. Are we done? Okay, so while we're on the subject of now, I like the way the guy mentioned that in Wikipedia there's a string of articles which I didn't even know about weird topics, and that any one of them would be very interesting. And so this one made the list. I'm not surprised, but I would like you to be aware that there's another price index that was created. Um, Now, by the way, the purpose of the Big Mac Index was really just to see how costs are different around the world for something that is identical in every country, and yet we can see that it's really not a tradable good. So you can't arbitrage off of differences in the Big Mac prices, but it does reflect local cost conditions. So another price index that was created to help us understand how much inflation is um, in the United States and any other country was created several years ago by a bank in Pittsburgh. And I'm not going to even tell you what it is until you see it. So it'll be a surprise. Okay. So let me show this to you because it totally is in the same spirit as the Big Mac Index. It's sort of almost a goofy way of helping us to understand how prices change over time. All right. And I think you'll like this one too. Hold on a second. But I'm not going to tell you until you see it. So now you're wondering what could this thing be? Hold on. All right, check this out. My God, were you surprised to see that? Well, I was, but well, I knew about it, but I mean, um, that was kind of fun, wasn't it? Now, if you think that's weird, it turns out that there is in existence another price index, which is based on the cost of a Starbucks latte. And I didn't see that here listed. Maybe I'll see if I can quickly find one. Just because while we're on the subject of weird price indexes, let's see if I can find this one. All right, this one looks promising. All right, um, let's do it. Let me just, well, hold on, hold on. Let me get you that link and let's check this out. All right, let's watch. All right. Well, how was that? That was, I was hoping there'd be more economics in that one, but still, it was kind of fun. Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah. Did they ever reopen that Starbucks on the campus? Does anyone know? Is even Fort Awesome even open? I haven't actually set foot on that campus since last March. It's kind of scary to think about. So I have no idea what's going on. Um, for I know, they might have closed it down. No, no, no. Obviously they didn't, but it's it's been a while. So I was just wondering if they kept the Starbucks open. But anyway, so yes, so price indexes, as you can see. Oh, you did. Ooh, okay. Well, the timing maybe not was perfect, but anyway, so yeah, so yes, there's others too, but I think the Big Mac index was the first one, because the Economist magazine is a very serious magazine. I mean, it's really like in the Wall Street Journal neighborhood as far as serious publications go. So when they brought this out, it seemed like it was kind of a goof, but it really also illustrates how price differences are very significant across different countries, and how a very similar product can be the cost can be very different across the world. And so that's where that got started, and the others sort of came along later. But anyway, so this PPP theory that we've been discussing sort of is based on the same logic. According to PPP, in the Starbucks and the Big Mac indexes, theoretically, the same price should be the cost of the Mac and the Starbucks should be exactly the same in every country once you take into account the exchange rate, but it usually doesn't work out that way. In fact, it often is way off. Yeah, it might be a good index for that. I think what they're trying to aim for is things that are relatively similar, and yet not terribly expensive. But again, the thing is that there's no way to arbitrage off of price differences. So it's not that surprising that the costs could be significantly different across different countries. And that's exactly what we found. In fact, next time I'm going to show you, I have a chart, and we can also look at the Economist website too, which shows that based on PPP, as far as it's concerned, most currencies are mispriced throughout the world. And in fact, in many cases by a substantial amount. So we'll have to say that for next time, of course, but I think you'll find that interesting, that discussion about how prices can be so different in different countries, which means basically the PPP doesn't really hold in practice. But anyway, I guess that's enough fun for one day, and I guess I'll just see you all. Oh, don't forget, do the chapter 4 problem set for next time, and then we'll carry on with chapter 12. All right. So I'll see you all on Thursday then.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay.
Thank you,
see
Professor.
later. All right. Bye.
Take care.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Professor.